I'm Alexandra Klitina, journalist of Kyiv Post. Today with us, representative of World Bank, Karlis Smits, lead economist and program leader for economic policy for the Eastern Europe. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good to see you.
What assistance has the World Bank provided since Russia's invasion to Ukraine started? Have the terms of cooperation with Ukraine changed?
First of all, the World Bank and all staff and everyone is with people in Ukraine at these difficult times. And since the beginning of the war, and we have been fully engaged in helping Ukraine. Our terms have changed because there's the urgency of helping Ukraine in these difficult times was of critical essence to limit the harm to Ukraine, to the people of Ukraine, and help the government in these difficult times. So our primary focus of assistance is to maintain continuity of the government to deliver its critical public services, because in event of the war, there is a need for government to continue to provide its functions, to pay wages in the public sector, education, health, and financial sector continuity. And also, we obviously understand in events like these, ability of the government to raise taxes to continue operate is compromised, obviously. And the most important aspect in our help was to provide budget support to Ukraine. We were among the first within the week of full-scale war provided a budget support operation to Ukraine, which provided money to fund government operations. It is important to understand also that those people who are in need, those who had to flee homes, also require government assistance in a sense that government assistance and stability of the financial sector, access to your banking account. So continue to the government services is a very important anchor of confidence, which also kind of helps stabilize financial sector stability. So this had been the primary focus of within the first hours of the war. We started to working addressing these very important issues.
What projects in Ukraine are a priority for the World Bank? Is anything going at the moment?
So the priority with this context has been the budget support operations is to provide resources to government of Ukraine. And up to now, we have mobilized with also the help of the donors around $13 billion to help Ukraine. And 11 of these $11 billion have been already delivered to Ukraine, to Europe. Because in a sense, one of the important aspects during the war and is it is very important to mobilize money because a lot of people want to help you. But the very difficult task is also to make sure that these resources are transferred to Ukraine, to the treasury account on time, so they can be used because the time is of essence. And we, in our view, budget support operations are these critical where you can deliver the most immediate relief for people of Ukraine. So our priority initially has been and up to now is to provide budget support and fund critical public services, particularly wage bill in public sector, education and health, because these functions are very important to maintain.
How do you assess the Ukrainian economy and what are the forecasts?
First of all, the impact of the war, there is economic impact, but most important impact is on the people of Ukraine, because there's no economic number that can quantify loss of life, disrupted lives, lost the loved ones and separation, which is kind of the impact of this war. And as in any kind of in most cases, the most vulnerable people of Ukraine pay the highest price of this. So in terms of the economic activity, there's multiple channels how it's been affected through disruption, displacement, disruption of the trade, access to the markets. So the impact of economy has been very severe. We have seen once in the first quarter very significant contraction of economic activity, around 45% in this kind of in March. What we have seen since then that there is some stabilization at the low levels, particularly after liberation of areas around Kyiv and Kharkiv, which are kind of large centers of economic activity. So we see kind of the signs of stabilization and a little bit of stabilization. So therefore, we also kind of a little bit adjusted our growth projections, contraction projections. Initially, we thought it's going to be 45%, but now we think it's a 35% contraction. But I think I want to come back to what I said. No number can measure the loss and suffering and pain inflicted on Ukraine. And the most important thing is to make sure that Ukraine's productive assets are kind of preserved, because in a sense, the impact of the war is that Ukraine's productive assets, its capital, is being destroyed and will need to be replaced. And also the second very important element of economic activity is labor force. So we have seen a lot of displacement internally and also kind of externally. What I also want to kind of mention, once you have this kind of impact of the war on destruction of the capital and also kind of displacement, what is important to mention the resilience of people and an ability to innovate and adapt. And there Ukraine has demonstrated, despite all the adversities, there's this courage in economic activity in a real sector. We see business activities try to restore what you have in a sense and deliver services in these adverse effects. And there are a lot of these kind of digital services, what Ukraine has been kind of advances is kind of helping to kind of do maintain continuation of the business services that we see kind of in government, financial sector, and also in a business. Having said that, the recovery process is going to be long, but I think the most important thing is to restore access to the markets internally and also the access to the markets externally, because one of the key transmission channels of this economic shock is through the loss of access to the export markets. One important aspect which I wanted to mention when we talk about economic aspect is economic war on Ukraine didn't start on February 24th. We kind of see the continuation of deterioration of economic kind of confidence already in November, because in a sense, this is transmitted through the loss of confidence, loss of access to the insurance market, and that kind of triggers a lot of impact in the economy through more difficulties in borrowing and accessing capital. And you saw what happened once insurance market is dysfunctional. For example, airlines cannot fly because airlines didn't fly even before the war, and the reason for that is because of that. So I think that kind of confident channel is kind of important, and I think it is important to recognize that Ukraine's economic infrastructure and economic structures were kind of under stress already before escalation of the war and full invasion in February 24th.
Are there special programs to cover military risks associated with doing business in Ukraine? I think investors are quite concerned about military risks, war risks.
I think you're going to put a very kind of important kind of a point, which is kind of insurance, which I kind of mentioned, and de-risking, because in a sense, if you kind of you are a business owner, you take a loan, you want to have an insurance, and then usually private companies would have kind of, they don't exclude terrorism kind of activities, which is kind of beyond their because these are things uninsurable, and usually in I think the important lesson there is that there will be a need to address that market failure when the private sector cannot price these risks, and usually that is kind of a government or the public sector who has a better risk pooling instruments to gather these risks. We within the World Bank we have a MEGA, which is Insurance Investment Guarantee Agency, which is kind of dealing a lot of these insurance issues. And we are trying to help because in a sense that's also an aspect in shipping industry, because in a sense a lot of your grain also needs to have insurance, and there is kind of insurance premiums are very high because of that. You have this very high risk. So this is kind of a one example where there would need to be kind of some innovative solution to address it, to particularly, as you mentioned, to de-risk that kind of risk. And there are a lot of examples in the United States after 9/11 terrorist attacks, also kind of the kind of government steps in to kind of address the terrorism risk. I think one example, I think even I mentioned airlines before, and I remember a week before the full-scale war started, government thought about the mechanism to create an escrow account to address this insurance in airline industry, so airlines could at least fly a little bit kind of Ukraine. These are kind of something that needs to be thought about because it's a very critical for business and also for people.
Is there any timeline for this solution available or not yet?
Well, in a sense, timeline is obviously now, right? Like in a sense, but it takes time to kind of design. I mean, everyone, I think, is working 24/7, not only in this institution but also other, to help Ukraine. I think you also want to kind of prioritize what are kind of stages. I think that the stage we are currently, the primary focus is on relief to provide critical support to the government functions and
Mhm.
to the people of Ukraine. And once the recovery and reconstruction starts, this would be the insurance would be the primary kind of the risking thing that
Mhm.
needs to be addressed. So the question is that important? Yes, that is an important, but in a sense, it's not perceived to be kind of the most critical constraint. But I think
Mhm.
when the recovery would start, for example, if you have an airline insurance addressed, the airlines wouldn't fly necessarily tomorrow, right? Like in a sense, because there's other kind of
Mhm.
constraints. But I think it is the lesson. What I'm trying to say is time to think about is now, because in a sense it takes time, but in a sense because you don't want to kind of lose a day once that to deploy these instruments.
Okay, the next question about Ukrainian budget. For next year, it's based 50% on international aid. Is World Bank ready to support Ukrainian authorities?
We are ready to support, and we are supporting Ukrainian authorities, and our support will continue next year. I think one important issue in a budget this year and next year is the following. As I mentioned, your needs are very significant that you need to finance the government, and your tax revenues are very low because of obvious reasons. It's not because of the policies. It is because it's economic contraction is very significant. And then you have a large financing needs, which is because of your deficit and rolling over the debt. What we have said before in 6 months when the war started, Ukraine can have internal resources to finance that gap. You can cut your essential services, you can monetize, you can borrow from the central bank, you can try to increase taxes. But ultimately, the price of that would be to the people of Ukraine, because in a sense, if you print money, it's going to be inflation tax to everybody. And if you cut government services, it's going to cut the critical support. And our message to the donor countries has been this is not the time to inflict additional pain to the people of Ukraine, which is already paying terrible price for during the war. And it is important to have a donor support, particularly to limit the harm to the people of Ukraine. So what we have seen this year, the donor support has been very significant, and particularly from the United States in the form of grants, because that's kind of is the most important help for Ukraine to need it, because in a sense, a lot of adding additional debt to finance it, being even it's in a very concessional basis from other donors, is future generations will have to repay. So the grant resources have been very critical to maintain continuity to the government services and to limit the harm to people of Ukraine. So going forward next year, we have a challenge that we need to mobilize the resource, and it's important to stay in a message that Ukraine needs resources now, not for tomorrow, because there's a lot of talk we would need a lot of resources for reconstruction. Yes, we would need a lot of resources for reconstruction, but resources are needed today to help the government to finance its critical public services, and that financing gap still remains quite significant. We estimate from the $3 to $4 billion equivalent every month in 2023. So you already have seen the first kind of draft of the budget, which is submitted to RADA, and we see that we have that kind of financing needs, but there's not a kind of a donor financing has not been lined up, right? Like in a sense, there's expectation that it would be 50-50, but I think in every day what we're working is advocating that these resources need to be committed, and that resources, more importantly, need to be dispersed on time to help government to make it. Because if resources would not be committed, then you resort to the same things as I mentioned. Either you start to print money, which is very harmful to inflation, or you to cut critical public services. And their government has already done very significant cuts since the war started, or it is cut to the bone. So additional cuts are possible, but it's going to be very harmful to people of Ukraine.
Is there any donor coordination? Because US actually committed to provide some help, also European Union, World Bank, and other IFIs. So, do you cooperate with each other?
Yes, but we do cooperate, and I'll give you a number of examples how we kind of cooperate. For example, in the United States is USAID. United States has committed a very significant amount of resources, but other challenges. One is kind of to mobilize these resources from Congress to put in a law approved, and also to deliver to the budget. And there is also going to be an important aspect. A lot of countries are democracies who provide these resources, so they want kind of accountability that these resources are indeed allocated to the budget line items, for example, that are critically needed, for example, healthcare, education. And there the World Bank helps is kind of saying is we can channel these grant resources, for example, from the United States through our existing project where we finance, for example, wage bill, education, health, and public administration. And we do the verification with the help of authorities in Ukraine, is to make sure that every dollar lent to Ukraine is having the maximum impact to helping these particular needs in education, healthcare, and social assistance. And that actually gives comfort and confidence, and this is also helps kind of to mobilize additional kind of resources, because this is kind of example of that cooperation. Then the second example is it is also important to share information among donors. What are your needs? And there's a lot of kind of conferences in Lugano where there is a government functioning in Ukraine, and it will continue to do so. So you know better what are your needs. So it's very important that donors coordinate and talk with Ukrainian authorities, because you know more what are the critical needs at the particular moment. Particularly today in Washington, D.C., we'll have a second roundtable in trying to mobilize additional support. So this is a roundtable with the Ukrainian government and World Bank and IMF and other donors to help Ukrainian. And the focus is to line up that support that is needed to support budget expenditure, finance budget expenditures for the next year, and also to lay ground for this kind of reconstruction needs that will be needed. Because in a sense, once the war ends, you want to reconstruction start in a day two after the war ends, and then that means a lot of the background work setting up these mechanisms to deliver these funds and these project ideas need to be already thought about today.
Which reforms Ukrainian authorities should implement first, in your opinion, to improve the situation?
I think when we look at kind of what is your path recovery and during the war, your future is, as your government has stated very clearly, is to be a full member of European Union. So that's your kind of anchor of how you do reforms. So your reform drive should be anchored this whatever it takes for your economy structures of the government to be the fully compliant for the full member of European Union. So that has to be your kind of a reform driver force, right? Like in a sense, ultimately. And I think that's is an important anchor. I think because that's an anchor that everybody in Ukrainian society is sharing, and I think that's is also ultimate kind of dividend of these reforms, because in a sense, membership and having the access to the full market of European Union is is this convergence machine that would have to go. The second kind of aspect which I want to kind of mention, there's always this tension about Ukraine. What should be the role of the government? Should it be kind of private sector or the government sector? Once we would go in a post-war recovery period, we would see the market failures in a number of issues. One is kind of, you mentioned about this de-risking, that the market cannot price these risks. So then you would have an issue when private sector is not fully able to restore its destroyed private type of assets. Let's say, for example, housing, we will have utility companies which usually work in a market base, you have a price and you have a cost recovery, would need support. So we would be for extended period of time where the public sector and government would need to help and step in. And the key challenge in having the reforms is because, in a sense, once a government becomes bigger, it's also kind of a lot of risks is in terms of the corruption, in terms of its efficiency. So I think one important aspect in that kind of reforms is to make an efficient government, to make so that it serves the people of Ukraine particularly and addresses the market failures which address in that. And I think you already kind of have benefited from these reforms of having a better, for example, digital services which were implemented before, actually is a good example because it allowed the government to continue to deliver the services to the population despite all the horrific events which are happening. My third point is reforms cannot be implemented from outside, right? Like in a sense, it needs to be implemented. Driver's seat of any reform has to be the government and the people of Ukraine. If somebody from outside says you need to do this, I mean, it wouldn't work, right? Like in a sense, because it might work in a short term, but experience from other countries show that you would need to have a reform commitment for a long period of time, and if it's not shared by everyone in government, it might will be difficult to achieve. So these are kind of my 3 points. I mean, point number one, EU anchor. So in a sense, and then the kind of efficiency of the government, and a third, like you have to like own it, kind of. So I think that the reforms and donor support is actually these kind of ingredients that I'm at least very optimistic about the future of Ukraine.
Can you tell more about working on Ukraine's recovery plan after the war? So, is World Bank committed to support, and in what extent?
So if you look at the history, the World Bank was established in end of the Second World War with a very unique mandate is to help post-war reconstruction, right? Like in the sense, so if you look at what is our mandate, it is a lot of things, but in reconstruction and development is our core mandate. And I think these two words are our kind of priority for Ukraine is reconstruction and development. And these go hand in hand because you don't want to reconstruct for the sake of reconstructing. You want to kind of reconstruct it in a better way that kind of promotes sustainable and inclusive development for people of Ukraine. We have done already kind of a preliminary work where we have looked at the reconstruction damages and needs assessment report, which kind of has a kind of a snapshot of what is damage has been done. So I think that's kind of usually is a first step, like to kind of having a blueprint what needs to be done next. While we don't know what would be the nature of kind of recovery, there's a lot of elements in that development which we know it will be true. Access to the markets is an important, for example, in a lot of these post-war recoveries in Germany, Korea, Japan, there's a very one common thread is that private sector needs to recover, and I think that has to be kind of a priority. And usually, for the private sector to recover fully, your domestic demand will likely to be very depressed because of the damage done. So having that external demand support the private sector is a very critical. And I think if you think about this economic development, that's kind of the first getting the private sector on its feet. And if you look at kind of what has been kind of a Marshall Plan's ideas, yes, there was a lot of resources, but there were two other elements which are very critical, is of giving access to the markets in developed markets for export capacity and helping the private sector also with kind of a knowledge and management how to operate in these markets and having access. So in that sense, I think that is kind of a precon that is a necessary condition for development. Would you also recognize that reconstruction recovery would need a lot of foreign savings, both from the kind of government sector, official donors, but I think it also needs to be recognized that government balance sheets even in the Western countries would be limited to provide a lot of resources. So private sector help through the foreign direct investment in Ukraine in post-war recovery would be very critical path to recovery. And again, your accession path to European Union provides a kind of anchor and kind of for why that so moving like foreign direct investment to Ukraine for the companies that operate in Europe is kind of for example, a rational decision.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this interview. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks. It
for
was,
help, Jane.
yeah, bye.